2021. Will the Solomon Islands be one of your first visits as PM, as it was when you became PM in 2018? And what do you think about the deal that's been signed?
Well, this is a very serious issue, and it comes as what has occurred in the Solomon Islands. And it comes as no surprise to our government. As you rightly said, Lani, after the last election, the first place I went was to Solomon Islands to sit down with Prime Minister Scott Morrison. Over the course of these last 3 years, I've spent an enormous amount of time working with all the Pacific leaders, stepping up in our Pacific Step Up, because the real risk, I think, is being exposed. Now, it's not news to me. The risk of China seeking to interfere within our region, I have known about and have been taking strong action about. I mean, I was the one who stood up and called out China on the pandemic. I was the one who called out their interference. I was the one who did all of this, and I was the one criticised for it, including by the Labor Party. So I'm pleased the Labor Party are catching up on this issue. But what this demonstrates is the very real risk that we have been aware of. That is why I've spent countless hours in meetings with Pacific Island leaders, particularly more recently when this particular arrangement came to light, working with the Prime Minister of New Zealand in particular. New Zealand and Australia works very carefully in these issues. And one of the things we strongly agree on and how we handle this issue within our Pacific family, we're siblings. There are not children and adults in that relationship. We treat the Pacific family as siblings and as family. And our view is very much that you don't go around stomping around telling leaders in Pacific Islands what they should and shouldn't do. You work with them respectfully and carefully. Now, Senator Zelja, I haven't finished the answer. This is a very serious issue, and I'd ask you to show some patience as I step through the important issues around this issue. Now, Senator Zelja, I'm pleased he was able to go, and the campaign was already underway. Prior to Senator Zelja's visit, I also sent very senior members of our national security officials team to go and meet not just in the Solomon Islands, but to brief other countries in the Pacific. I've been in regular contact with Prime Minister Bainimarama, who is the leader of the Pacific Island Forum, and there is strong concern across the Pacific and with allies and partners, particularly the United States, about where this is heading. But it only underscores and highlights the reason for the actions we have been taking for many years. And let me run you through some of those actions. Our development program in the Solomon Islands, some $161.2 million in 2021-22. It covers areas of health, economic recovery, education, agriculture. We have the largest development partner in the Solomon Islands, partnering around 2/3 of all assistance. We provided $1.85 billion in development assistance to the Pacific. That's our budget for next year. That is up from $1.12 billion when Labor were last in office. We've invested in the undersea cable project to ensure the security of their communications networks in the region. We've got $30 million going through the Pacific Finance Facility that we put in place that is developing the Tina River Transmission Project, essential for the economies of the Solomon Islands. And so all the way through, we work respectfully with these countries, and they know that Australia is a great friend. Australia remains their first port of call because we have AFP officers on the ground right now. The first place they called was Australia. And so we will continue to work respectfully with the Solomon Islands. I look forward to making a visit there at the first opportunity. As you rightly said, it was the first place I went to. And with COVID, it has been difficult to travel in the region. But we've ensured that we've continued to do that, and I've seen Pacific leaders very, very regularly. The right response was to ensure that the Minister for the Pacific, we were very aware of where that agreement was up to, as were all other Pacific leaders. It was very important that we communicated very clearly to the Prime Minister of the Solomon Islands, Manasseh Sogavare, what the Australian government's position was. And to do that at that level made very clear that Australia was not looking to go and stamp around, that we were going to deal constructively and respectfully. That is...
even work. She's the foreign minister.
At a different level to the Minister for Pacific. One is in cabinet, one is not. You calibrate your diplomacy to deal with sensitive issues.
Why is this not important enough for a cabinet minister?
Because, as I said before, in the Pacific, one of the things you've got to be very, very cognizant of is there is a long history of, frankly, countries like Australia and even New Zealand and others coming around and treating Pacific Islands like they should be doing what the big countries should tell them to do. That is what... No, hang on. You've asked me the question about why this is important. Now, I've had a lot of experience in this area and I've dealt with Pacific countries for a long time, including before I went into Parliament. One of the things you don't do in the Pacific is you don't throw your weight around. What you do is you treat others respectfully and you ensure... Look, I'm very conscious of how visits are perceived within the Pacific. This was the right calibrated way to address this issue with the Prime Minister. I've had discussions with the Prime Minister personally about these issues. I've spoken to Manasseh on many occasions, many occasions, as I talk to Pacific leaders all the time, and particularly about this issue. So the judgment was made not to engage in a more, at a foreign minister level engagement, to ensure that Australia's views were communicated very clearly and very respectfully, and that has been done. And this is an ongoing issue. This is an ongoing issue. That secret agreement, the Solomon Islands Prime Minister was very determined to resolve it. There is a lot of influence going on in the Pacific, and there is a lot of pressure being placed on other Pacific countries around our region. And what they need to understand is that I am going to work with them. I'm not going to act like former administrations that treated the Pacific like some extension of Australia. The Pacific Islands are very sensitive to that. And I've always had an approach with the Pacific Islands which understands those sensitivities, because there is a lot at stake.
No one's arguing. The point that this hasn't come as a surprise. How were you informed that the deal was finalised? Have you spoken to Manasseh Sugabari in the last 24 hours? And given that you say this has been an ongoing issue, doesn't that just show Australia has become complacent and that China has done a better job on the diplomatic front?
No, I don't think you can draw that conclusion. I think, again, what this highlights is that over the last 5 years in particular, the level of interference and the level of engagement, and particularly, with all sorts of promises of all sorts of investments, that can be very persuasive. And so that is the challenge that we're now dealing with, and we've been dealing with it for many years. It is not a new issue, and these threats still remain. I speak to other Pacific leaders about it all the time, and what we reassure them about, and you can't always be fully persuasive on these issues. What I assure them about is that Australia will be there for you as we always are, not because we want anything from you, but because we see the Pacific as our family, and we want to stand by our family and ensure that they can have the sovereignty that they have earned, that they believe in very strongly, and we want to support them in that. And so the Solomon Islands government, through a duly elected Prime Minister and a cabinet, have made a decision that they are allowed to make. Of course they are. They're a sovereign country, and we have to respect their sovereignty. And so now with this arrangement, we need to ensure we work with them to see that Australia's obvious interests aren't compromised, because we believe that in our interests, that their strength and their sovereignty is not compromised by these types of arrangements. And that's why I sent the national security officials to go and provide a briefing to the Prime Minister, as I did to a number of other leaders in the region. Now, I can't go into the reasons as to why I am aware of whether agreements have been reached or not. That is not appropriate in terms of how the Australian government operates. Okay.